Okay. Hi, my name is Nicole Charleson-Libby. I am doing my presentation on epilepsy. My best friend has epilepsy, so this is kind of why I started doing it. Was due to her because she kind of inspired me, and my favorite childhood actor, Cameron Boyce, passed away due to an epilepsy seizure. So that's why it's kind of a really personal one for me to do. So, this is my slide, and I hope you guys like it. So, what is epilepsy? Well, epilepsy is a neuron in your brain that affects the frontal lobe and um, your frontal lobe and your temporal lobes. And they're basically neurons that are not lining up with the other parts of your brain, so they're sending signals that are not lining up. Epilepsy actually affects millions of worldwide. It can be life-threatening, depending on the type of epilepsy you have, because if you have epilepsy, you probably could have a brain injury, cerebral palsy, you could have brain tumors, you could have a head trauma, a brain infection, and you could also have autism, which is one of the side effects of having epilepsy. So the public awareness of having the knowledge and history about epilepsy, it can really help someone who might end up having a seizure and you possibly not knowing what to do. But with this tips and resources, I hope that this brings you more knowledge of what you could do. And one of those steps is that you can actually, when someone is having a seizure, you'll want to lay them on the ground, no resisting them. You want to lay them flat on the ground. You're going to turn them on their side, so they're on their sideways, and you're going to want to record time, pull out your phone, record the time of how long the seizure lasts. If the seizure lasts more than 5 minutes, you're going to want to call 911, because it can be a way more life-threatening in a seizure, and if they don't get the medical attention they need, they can end up dying. So always record, call 911, whether the seizure lasts 5 minutes or not 5 minutes, always call 911, because they can give them the medical attention they need and decide if they need to go to the hospital or not, versus you not calling them on and them have a seizure and then they be like, oh, I'm okay, and then something else happened. So the misconceptions about seizures is the energetic responses is no one responds to these seizures. They just kind of ignore it. And that can be really deadly. And I really want to educate and advocate that more people get the resources and are ensuring the care that so everyone in this world, someone we walk with, we talk with on a daily basis, could possibly have epilepsy. And I want to give you the resources and tools so you are fully prepared of what's going to happen. And I hope that helps. Some of the barriers in having epilepsy is that they don't always, medically wise, insurance companies will not help you cover this medical. Because even though you've been diagnosed by a doctor, professional doctor, and you go to the pharmacist to see if you could get your medicine, the insurance can decline it and not cover any of it. And that is a lot of situations for a lot of people where they are having to pay for stuff out of pocket because their insurance company will not cover the cost of epilepsy medicine, which is what a lot of people use to help them because they have epilepsy. And this happens in low income, middle income countries about 80% of the time, because there is limited to insurance and insurance declining the pay, and they don't want to help, so they make you pay it fully out of pocket, which is really sad. And so this causes a lot of issues for families. So the effects of it depends, because it can affect, having epilepsy can affect your brain in different ways. Even though the temporal lobe, it can affect the memory, the emotion, the language, the speech. Then if it's affecting your frontal lobe, it will affect your movement, behavior, speech. And both hemispheres symptoms of conscious muscle contraction, and they both show behavior changes during both of these being affected, or one or the other being affected, affects you a lot depending on the type of person. So some of the signs and symptoms I looked at were adults versus children. So the adults have a few more than children do, which is temporary confusion, starting spells, and muscles stiffening or jerking. They also lose consciousness. They do go through some emotional and physical changes, and then they do have slow thinking and speaking. And for children, it's a little bit different. They have the staring spells, of relapses in attention. Sometimes they have falls, or they have a repetitive of jerky. They also do come with a language regression, so they can't. Might be harder for them to speak. And also, with having epilepsy, it does make learning and academic things really challenging for them. It does take them a little bit longer to learn things and catch on a little bit fast. It might take them longer to catch on of what we're. There are some due to like having epilepsy, things that are affecting the brain. It can make it developmental delays and sometimes speech and motor skills, which is where an SLP would come in, and they would help define all of those things. So as an SLP, which is a speech pathologist, we would come in, and an academic, we would gather a team, we would obviously make sure your family and peers have the tools they need to support you and engage with you and be able to help you. There are a lot of times children feel a lot of behavioral changes, same as adults, behavioral changes, where the anxiety and frustration of not being able to do something or say something because of the effects of either your temporal or your frontal lobe being affected by having epilepsy. So most of the time, when the most common area of involved when someone has epilepsy, it's usually the temporal, but also in the focal epilepsy area of your brain, which is where the sensory or some memory is all kind of located. And so those things are highly affected when it is in the temporal lobe. So the frontal lobe is a little bit different because it affects your behavior and stuff, but it also causes motor seizures, and that can be a little bit more scary of a seizure to deal with because there is a high more risk for that. So some of the speech that impacts adults would be comprehension. If it is a temporal lobe seizure, it will affect your comprehension and memory. And then if it's the frontal lobe seizure, it's going to affect a little bit more. It's going to be impaired speech, production, and fluency. And then word finding is going to be difficult with both either or of adults dealing with temporal lobes or frontal lobe seizures. Word finding difficulties is going to affect both sides. Your speech is going to be much more slower on both front ends and slurred speech. And organizing, I think most people deal with that as frustrating having epilepsy, is that challenging faces organizing and thoughts verbally. For children, there is a delayed language development, so it takes them a little bit longer to talk and stuff due to either temporal lobe or the frontal lobe affecting them. The speech is very hard for them to medicate, and medication side effects along with that can affect them with their speech. And it's definitely with the side effects of medication for children, it is making them have slowed processing on what is needed of them to do. So it might take them a little bit longer to comprehend what you're asking for them. There is also for children, there is physiological factors. So they're going to probably end up having a lot of anxiety, low confidence, and hindered communication, which basically means they probably won't talk as much. They're not going to speak a lot because they have the anxiety that what they say might not make sense, or it might take too long to speak, and people just, it might affect their confidence a lot. Some of the language that impacts for adults and children with epilepsy. For adults, it will be the Bronx area, because that is where your speech production starts becoming the difficulty. Then, if a seizure is in the other part, is in the Wernicke's area, that is going to be the comprehension problem. So you're going to have a little bit more comprehension of understanding language barrier. It's going to be a lot more harder to talk. Some words that you try to say are going to be a lot more harder to speak and say than versus someone who doesn't have epilepsy and is able to speak clearly, understand what you're trying to say. There's going to be reduce of fluency and verbal expressions from people with epilepsy as adults. The only thing that I could find that affects adults with language impacts of epilepsy with medication is just slow processing, where things take a little bit longer for them to process what you're asking them, so it takes them a little bit longer to process what you said to them. Versus a child, it might take them a process, but they could probably catch on a little bit faster. Again, the same thing for adults and children. The physiology of language impacts with epilepsy is the anxiety, stigma, low confidence, just because talking for all of us is not easy, and let alone having a medical condition that could affect your language makes it 10 times harder, and it affects you horrendously. What I found for children is language regression, delayed language development, seizure activity disrupt learning, and communication growth. So when you have a seizure, it takes a lot to bounce back after having a seizure as a child. It's scary as a child having a seizure, until you're probably used to it and you're old enough to really understand why you're having it, and maybe not be as scary because you can feel it coming and that it's going to happen. And as a child, it's still developing and learning what this is and what's happening to you and what your brain is trying to tell you, but you can't explain it. It can be very challenging and scary for a child going through this. It definitely, with having epilepsy for a child, for physiology, there's going to be continuously frustration because you want to be so independent. You want to be able to do things at school, outside of school, and because you have this, it can hold you back a little bit on what you can and can't do, which is very scary and sad. Swallowing impacts of epilepsy for adults with seizures in the frontal lobe, temporal lobe, and brainstem impaired. They have swallowing phases. So that's going to include with chewing delays, swallowing reflex, and poor throat coordination, which could end up with having this. You're going to probably end up with having nectar-thick foods or more purees type food due to the being unable to swallow and difficulty chewing. So they might put you on a nectar-thick puree type diet due to the type of epilepsy that you've been affected by. Depends. There's going to be some weakness after you go through a seizure, and you're going to want to take it slow. When my best friend has these, I've only seen her go through a couple of seizures, and she comes out of it, she's really loopy, dizzy, and just kind of confused. So they try to make sure she's okay and take her slow, having her sit up and, making sure she knows where she's at and that she's safe. And then just making sure she didn't swallow anything, didn't choke on anything. So that's kind of been helpful. The same thing with medication swallowing. You're probably going to have some dry mouth, sedation, and muscle incoordination, which can be a little challenging because you're not going to want to drive or anything after you take medication. For children, developmental for swallowing is developmental epithelials. And this is going to be motor development, a poor oral coordination, so definitely motor and final skills are going to be a little delayed in this due to the that impassive swallowing and trying to coordinate to your brain how to do something.